Okay, and we will start. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world. My name is Evan Weiner. Thank you to Tara and the Summers Library for inviting me. This is the second of 3 talks I have this year. The next one is in October. That will be the calendar year 1968, which follows 1967. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a graduate of Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, went to Ramapo College, and the reason I bring that up was because in 1971, to give you a little bit of background on me, I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio. That was in 11th grade English. He didn't know any of our names, still doesn't, because I still see Joe occasionally, 49 years later. And Joe comes up to me and says, "You have a good voice. How would you like to be in radio?" Yeah, I want to be in radio the worst way possible. And I was. I was on WRKL. We did a high school show called Tiger Talk. It was 15 minutes every Tuesday afternoon at 3:45. It was a horrible show, but it opened the door for me in radio and also for newspapers as well, because Joe was connected with the Nyack, New York Journal News, which has no resemblance to the Journal News here in Westchester. It's a separate entity right now, owned by different people. And also the Hackensack Bergen Record. Fast forward to 1978, I'm 21 years old. I'm out of college. I left college in 1977, graduated, so I was a year ahead. And I got a job with WGRC, Nanuet, New York in Rockland County, and my boss was Steve North. And in the library, you might have some of his works because he ghost wrote a lot of Jerry Rivers, Geraldo Rivera's books. Anyway, Steve, this is March of 1978. He had hired me 2 months prior, and he said, "You got to work on Saturdays." That wasn't a problem because Rockland Community College had a speakers program. And among the speakers I interviewed in January and February were Ralph Nader and Julian Bond. So this is March of 1978. And Steve says on Saturday, the New York State Democrats are holding a fundraiser at the Nyack Tappan Zee Townhouse. Can you go over there? Or I want you to go over there. Don't worry about getting anything. We'll save it for Monday morning. Nothing important is going to happen. And also remember, if something does happen, to tell the Associated Press and United Press International. So here I am. I'm 21 years old, a full head of hair, you know, as cocky as a 21-year-old could be. And I walk into the place, and the first guy I see is somebody who, I don't know if you ever heard of this guy or not. He's an obscure assemblyman, Jerome Nadler, Jerry Nadler. Ever hear of Jerry Nadler? He comes in first, and then comes Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then comes Hugh Carey, and then comes Mario Cuomo. He's running for lieutenant governor, and Mario has with him his 19-year-old son, Andrew, and his little kid, Chris at the time, and Matilda, his wife, is there at the time. And then there's a tall guy. He's like 6'4", good-looking guy. Looked like he could have been on TV or in the movies. Sandy, blonde hair, angular face, and good physique. And he walks right up to me, and he says, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me something?" "I want to tell you something." Never introduced himself, but I knew who he was because I watched Batman. And he was the mayor of Gotham City. It was John Lindsay. And John Lindsay said to me, "I'm running for Senate." The Senate seat would open up in 1980. This is 1978. So he tells that to me. And I call Marlene Egg over at the Associated Press, Randy Berlage at UPI, go back to my station, file the report, and get a call from WNEW Radio in New York. Now, some of you probably listened to WNEW in New York at one time. And William B. Williams, or on the FM, Scott Muni, depending on what side of the fence that you were on. And it's Henry Marcotte. And he says, "Can you do that story for us?" "Sure. How much are you going to pay me?" $10. Sold. And with that, I started 3.5 years as a stringer for WNEW in New York. And I covered Reagan in the presidential race in 1980. Did an interview with him. I covered the Iranian hostages coming back from Stewart Air Force Base, and my last story there was the Brinks robbery in Nyack, New York. So that's a little bit about my background. And we're going to go back to 1967. I was all of 10 and 11 years old in 1967. And the guy on the screen right there is Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary told you to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And he's addressing the hippies in San Francisco. 1967 is like the Paul McCartney song, Hello, Goodbye. Was it the summer of love, or was it the summer of something else? Summer of war, summer of rioting. It was both. So there's Timothy Leary, who was addressing the crowd in San Francisco at the time. And that is Newark, New Jersey. In case you forgot, Newark, New Jersey, there was a massive riot in Newark, New Jersey. The Beatles came out with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, which is the first rock album, first rock concert concept album. Frank Sinatra had concept albums in the 1950s. Nobody really talks about those, but this was the first concept album where the Beatles weren't the Beatles, they were somebody else. From the Beatles, a couple days later, those are Israeli troops on the Western Wall. You have the 6-Day War. Back in June, Jimmy Up Monterey Pop Festival. In Sacramento, Ronald Reagan is sworn in as the governor of California. So the question here is, was the summer of '67 the summer of love or the summer of war? It was actually both. There were hippies in San Francisco, but there was a war in Vietnam, and there was a war in the Middle East, and American streets lit up with rioting. The psychologist, Dr. Timothy Leary, told 30,000 hippies, and I'm going to get into the hippies because the hippies are kind of a strange phenomenon, because who were the hippies and what were the hippies? I'm going to ask you that in a few minutes. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Use some LSD if you can. Hey, Groucho Marx did. Nothing wrong with it. If Groucho could do it, you could do it. There was rioting in the streets of Detroit, rioting in the streets of Newark, New Jersey. These are hippies. Well, they may not have been hippies because we don't exactly know what a hippie was. There's no literature. Nothing was left behind discussing what exactly a hippie was. But if you go to a bakery in San Francisco in Fisherman's Wharf, there's a little San Francisco counterculture museum inside that bakery that overlooks all the restaurants in the wharf. I was there in November. And it talked about the summer of love. The hippie counterculture movement culminated with the summer of love by fall. Sayings like feeling groovy gave way to make love, not wars. Chants. Chances youth protested the escalating conflict in Vietnam and staged marches and sit-ins on behalf of the civil rights movement. And there is the symbol of peace, not of the hippies. Hippies had no symbols. Hippies left no ideology behind them. They just had a good summer. The United States offered two narratives. One was fire bases, napalm, jungles, and the draft, Vietnam. The other was communes, LSD, flowers, rock music. And San Francisco was the epicenter of both tales. It would be in San Francisco that many of the soldiers who went on to Vietnam, the last place they saw in the United States was San Francisco, well, actually Oakland across the bay, but they went down to Haight-Ashbury, which was the center of the hippie movement. And there is the U.S. Army Oakland Port of Embarkation. That is where you went. You got through there, you were sent off to Vietnam. San Francisco was the last place that a service member would see before heading off to Vietnam. By 1967, Lyndon Johnson had about 500,000 troops, men and women. And I did a 1968 talk about a year and a half ago, and there was a woman who said to me, you keep referring to them as men. She said, don't refer to all of them as men. There were women there. They weren't necessarily fighting the war, but there were nurses and other support staff that were helping out. So yeah, predominantly it was men, but there were some women who were among the 500,000. Lyndon Johnson, in December of 1964, there were about 4,500 people in Vietnam, 23,000 in 1965. By 1967, about 450,000, half of whom shipped out from the Oakland Army Base. Now again, The hippies. 70 million baby boomers came of age. Well, not all of them, but the ones who were born in 1946 and 47 and 48 and 49 came of age. And a lot of them who had the means ended up in San Francisco. Hippies on Haight-Ashbury. 70 million baby boomers came of age. Many resisted middle-class shackles and advocated free speech, free love, and psychedelic enlightenment. But if you ask people in San Francisco, and I've had some people who have talked to who have been to this talk, they said, we just went down there and had a good time. Nobody else went down there because there was any kind of ideology. A woman I know up in Connecticut was a bank teller by day and a hippie by night. She went there, had a good time. I asked her if you ever indulge. She said, I'll plead the fifth. Between 1966 and 68, the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became the scene of the hippie movement. It gave rise to San Francisco rock sounds, the groups, Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Janis Joplin, Moby, Grape, Country Joe and the Fish, The Great Society, and Steve Miller Band. Grace Slick, remember Alice? Remember the song Alice? White Rabbit? Celebrity Cruises uses that as one of their commercials, White Rabbit, which was a hippie drug song, as drug song as you could get. It's used today to sell celebrity cruises. 1967, the first Super Bowl. It wasn't known as the Super Bowl at that time. It was known as the American Football League, National Football League World Championship game. It was played in Los Angeles. 1/3 of the Los Angeles Coliseum was empty. It was the last time the NFL AFL championship game, which became the Super Bowl in 1969, was not sold out. The Green Bay Packers won the game 35-10, beating the Kansas City Chiefs. Vince Lombardi did not want to be there. Why should we play the Mickey Mouse team, the Mickey Mouse League? By the way, I got a question about Mickey Mouse while I'm at it here, because when I grew up, and when some of you probably grew up, when something second rate or third rate was, when you want to refer to something as a second or third rate product, it was a Mickey Mouse thing. Mickey Mouse thing. You know how much that rodent is worth? That rodent is worth at least $66 billion. At least $66 billion. But I don't know why people refer to something that they thought is second rate as a Mickey Mouse thing. I mean, it just made no sense to me. But anyway, the Packers would win 35-10. And of course, the Super Bowl now is a quasi-national holiday every February, maybe not in 2021 with COVID pandemic, but it has become bigger than a game. It's an event. 3 astronauts were killed on the launch pad in January of 1967. That's Gus Grissom on the left, Ed Wood White in the middle, Roger Chaffee on the right side. Roger was just 31 years old from Rhode Island. Had a friend by the name of Dick Hull. Dick, H-O-L-L, was part of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. In fact, he was in Australia working the camera, so to speak, when the Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And a lot of this story comes from Dick, who is in his 80s now and living near Cape Canaveral. It was Apollo 1, and it was supposed to be the first Apollo craft to go into low Earth orbit. The Apollo missions were designed to bring men to the moon. It was scheduled to be launched on February 21st, 1967. There was a dress rehearsal January 27th, and a fire took place, and it killed Grissom, White, and Chaffee. This is what my friend Dick Hull told me. He said, first of all, he said it's a miracle that we ever got to the moon. Every corner was cut. As you know, in government, you have to sell to the lowest bidder. And all the corners were cut. He said, this thing should have been avoided totally. He said, never should have happened. He said, basically, they put in pure oxygen. They didn't have to put pure oxygen into the craft during a dress rehearsal. But they did. And there was a spark. And it caught fire. And within a minute, they were all gone. And he said that basically, before I get to the Smothers Brothers, he said basically they made a mistake. eventually they would talk about how the spacecraft wasn't wired correctly and that it was an accident waiting to happen. Now, February 5th, 1967, the Smothers Brothers were on CBS. Now, how many of you remember the Smothers Brothers? How many of you liked the Smothers Brothers? Enjoyed the Smothers Brothers? Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Well, CBS has a problem in the 1960s. Their shows are getting old. Ed Sullivan's getting old. Ed Sullivan was bringing more and more younger people in. Red Skelton was getting old. Lucy was getting old. Miss Kitty was no longer Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke anymore. She was getting old. And they had all those rural comedies, which I loved. Petticoat Junction, which was a groundbreaking show, and I'll tell you why. It was the first TV show that a woman was the center of the show and the boss. Kate Bradley running the Shady Rest Hotel. They also had one of my favorite stupid shows of all time, Green Acres. So they had old shows and they had rural shows. And Bill Paley, who's running CBS at this point, is looking to change things. And he figures he's got Tommy and Dick Smothers around. They did a show back in 1963. Let's give them a variety show. They also gave Carol Burnett a variety show at this point. But Tommy and Dick were just about 30 years old, and they wanted to bring in a younger audience because everybody else was bringing in an older audience. They wanted younger people. They wanted college-educated people with money. So they bring in Tom and Dick Smothers and think, well, we're gonna have a show, and it's gonna be great because it's just gonna be a variety show. Well, it just didn't work out that way because Tommy Smothers decided, I'm gonna be a young guy, and I'm gonna be a guy who is with the audience that we're gonna have. We're gonna become political, and we're gonna be the first political show that's on TV, since that was the week that was with David Frost in 1964. April 4th, 1967, 366 days, because 1968 was a leap year. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers a speech at the Riverside Church in Upper Manhattan. And at the church, he states his opposition to Vietnam, the war in Vietnam. And he states, somehow, this madness must cease. Got to get rid of the war, bring our boys home. I don't know how many of you burn draft cards, but this guy's burning his draft card in Central Park. He's against the war, and one of the first draft card burning ceremonies that takes place is in Central Park in April of 1967, April 15th. And there are about 60 young men, some of them from Cornell, and they come together and they decide to burn their draft cards. They burnt it in a Maxwell House coffee can. I don't know why they didn't take Sanka or U-Ban, those brands at that point. They burnt it in a Maxwell House coffee can. Of course, it's symbolic against the war because they would get another draft card soon thereafter. But there they are. They're burning their draft cards in the sheet metal in Central Park. Protests begin in the country. The protests, actually, the organizers start in 1966. That is San Francisco there. And the protests would start with something called the Spring Moby protests in New York and in San Francisco and other places. About 300,000 young people go out to the streets. And they decide to start chanting, hey, 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 LBJ, how many kids you killed today? Get out of Vietnam. It was founded in November of 1966, the Spring Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. But that was not the first protest against Vietnam. The first protest about 2 months earlier at the University of Wisconsin, and that was not even against the war in Vietnam. That was against the Dow Chemical Company that came on campus to recruit scientists. Dow Chemical was making Agent Orange at the time, which was maiming people in Vietnam, and the students had had enough and protested Dow's presence on the campus. And there is Muhammad Ali. And in April of 1967, Muhammad Ali gave up everything. He had been called up to his draft board, which was in Houston, Texas. And he did go to Houston, Texas. he was actually called up for military service in 1966. The induction would have been April 27th, 1967 in Houston. He attends the induction, but he refuses to answer his name or take the oath of the military. With that, Muhammad Ali is immediately stripped of his boxing title. He's immediately stripped by Nelson Rockefeller of his boxing license in New York, and he's stripped without due process. Nobody ever gave him a chance to defend himself, whether it was the boxing license or whether it was the World Boxing Association, which pulled his title. They just stripped it immediately. And there is Muhammad Ali walking in Houston after refusing to take the oath. He is arrested. He faces 5 years in jail. He faces a $10,000 fine, and he also has no living all of a sudden. And his reasoning for not taking the oath, not going into the armed forces, and not becoming what Joe Louis basically did during World War II, fighting exhibitions, is simple. He ain't got nothing against the Vietnamese, and he's a conscientious objector. Why should they ask me to put a uniform on and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? That was his reasoning. And Ali would go out into the wilderness for the next 3.5 years in terms of boxing. He was convicted. The conviction eventually overturned by the Supreme Court in 1971, but he wasn't going. A woman who came to one of my talks, I think it was the 1969 talk, told me that the highlight of her protesting career in New York was standing 6 feet away from Muhammad Ali, who was there protesting, although Ali said he never protested the war. He just was a conscientious objector. That is me and Ali in 1965. By this point, the Parkinson's had kicked in, and I really couldn't say very much to him. Joe Frazier actually gave him money, threw money at him to keep him going. So did some athletes from Cleveland, Ohio, what was called the Cleveland Summit. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was part of that Cleveland Summit, as Lou Alcindor in those days. And they interviewed him for about 6 hours to see if he was legit or not. He was legit. I have a friend by the name, or had a friend by the name of Shelly Saltman, who passed away in February of 2019. Shelly and I were really good friends, and the last good day of his life, he said, was spent with me in Yonkers back in 2018. He was doing a Hudson River cruise for a few days, and I took him around Westchester, he and his girlfriend and my wife that day. But Shelly was telling, and Shelly did things like promote the battle of the sexes between Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King. Also, Evel Knievel's Snake River Canyon jump. Evel Knievel beat Shelly Saltman up on the Fox lot with a baseball bat. But he was telling me about Ali, and he's hired by Ali to be the promoter of the Frazier-Ali fight at Madison Square Garden, March 8, 1971. And the first thing he tells Ali, he says, "I don't like you. I served in Korea," although Shelly never saw any action in Korea. He said, "I don't like you. You're a disgrace to the veterans." And Muhammad Ali said, "Let me sit down. Let me explain some things to you." 3 hours later, Shelly was convinced that Muhammad Ali was legit. He stayed with Ali until 1979. He and the fight doctor for the Pacherco both quit because they didn't want to see their friend being battered. They were part of the inside circle at one point, and they knew he wasn't going to get out without brain damage. But Shelly told me this story that most people don't know about. 1975-76, Ali is in this wrestling boxing thing in Tokyo with Anthony Inoki. And Inoki just lays on the campus and just kicks at Ali's legs. That's all he does for whatever the time they were in. And Ali develops blood clots in his legs. And he's told by the doctor, it's all swollen and all that other stuff, "You got to go to the hospital." Ali said, "No, I made a commitment. I'm going to entertain the troops in South Korea. That is where I'm going. I don't care what happens to me. I made a commitment. I am going to entertain those troops." He went there to entertain the troops from the United States Army stationed in South Korea. Why? he had an obligation to the military that he made that he was going to keep. He ended up in the hospital. He did have a lot of problems. He was in critical condition for a little while. They finally drained all the blood clots and everything else, and he went back to fighting. So there is the story you probably don't know that Shelly told me about Muhammad Ali. His career effectively over, and he would come back. Also, in 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel and Egypt and Syria, starts in June. By the mid-1960s, Syrian-backed Palestinian guerrillas began staging attacks across the Israeli border, provoking reprisal raids from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Shelly's cousin, Shelly Saltman, set up the IDF. Just in case you're wondering about the IDF, Shelly's cousin did that in Israel. In April 1967, the skirmishes worsened. Israel and Syria fought an air and artillery engagement. 6 Syrian fighter jets were destroyed. And there is Nasser from Egypt, and he's involved. You got to remember, there was once a country called the UAR, which was an amalgamation between Egypt and Syria. That didn't work out, but they still had a close relationship in 1967. In the wake of that air battle, the Soviet Union provided Egypt. Leonid Brezhnev provided Egypt from the Soviet Union with intelligence that Israel was moving troops to its northern border with Syria in preparation for a full-scale invasion. Information was kind of shaky. Let's say, just call it shaky. Actually, the information was incorrect. The Israelis were not moving there, but the Russians passed it, rather the Soviets passed it off to Nasser, and Nasser strikes into action. He's supporting his Syrian allies, and with that, the Egyptian forces would advance into the Sinai Peninsula, and they throw out the United Nations peacekeeping force that had been guarding the border since the last skirmish in 1956. So UN is added there. And there is a UN Border Patrol Guard. On May 22nd, 1967, Nasser banned Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran, the sea passage that connected the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. A week later, has a deal with King Hussein of Jordan. So it's Jordan, Syria, and Egypt getting ready to go to war against Israel if need be. And there is more Israeli army pictures. In the weeks leading up to the war, the Syrian and Egyptian leaders made no secret of the fact that there was going to be a joint coalition that was coming together to destroy Israel. Barbara, do you have something to say? See your hand up? Nope. At the same time, Jordan was warned by Israel, stay away from the conflict. Don't get involved. You'll be sorry. On the morning of June 5th, 1967, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault, which destroyed 90% of the Egyptian army on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. And with that, the war is virtually over, even before it starts. More Israeli tanks. Within 3 days, the Israelis had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground. They captured the Gaza Strip, all of the Sinai Peninsula, east to the bank of the east bank of the Suez Canal. And there is the architect of the Israeli victory, Moshe Dayan, General Moshe Dayan. Quick aside about Moshe Dayan. I knew Joe and Shirley Wurshberg. They were part of Morrow's team, Morrow's boys, and the girl, Shirley. And Moshe Dayan is flying in a helicopter in 1957 with Joe, Shirley, and Ed Morrow. And Moshe Dayan looks at Ed Morrow and says, why are you smoking those things? Don't you think that stuff is, don't you know that stuff is going to kill you? And Morrow said, no, it's okay. That's not going to kill me. Morrow was smoking 5 packs of cigarettes a day. Morrow would be dead within about 5-6 years. Moshe Dayan was right about that as well. Story from Joe Wurshberg. Israel was led to the victory by Dayan. Israel doubled in size. They conquered Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. It's been 53 years, and they are still fighting over pieces of what Israel claimed back in 1967. A lot of this stuff is still unresolved, as you well know, 53 years later. The Arab leaders met in Khartoum in the Sudan in August of 1967 and signed a resolution that promised no peace, no recognition, no negotiation with Israel. And that would hold up until Anwar Sadat became the president of Egypt about 6-7 years later after that. Now, on June 1st, 1967, in England, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which, according to the hippies and those people, changed everything. We got to listen. There are messages in there. There are messages in there. The only message that was in there was, we're tired of being Beatles. Let's be someone else. Let our imagination be somewhere else. There was no other message in there. And it was a combination of dance hall music, Honey Pie, the dance hall music, LSD type music. The album was fueled with LSD. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, thought to be a reference to LSD, wasn't LSD. It was a drawing by Julian Lennon's friend of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And there was Indian music on there with George Harrison. So there were all kinds of things on there. And if you ever watch American Bandstand, there's an old clip with Dick Clark, and it's the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane video, which was supposed to be included in this album. And Dick Clark is talking to everybody. What'd you think? And they're all in shock. Look at them. They're not the lovable mop tops anymore. And one of the questions was, will the Monkees overtake the Beatles? Because the Monkees were the mop tops at that point, but the Beatles moved to a new phase. In Britain, it was the #1 album, June of 67 to February 68, 27 weeks on the top of the charts, and it had an initial run of nearly 3 years, in spite of the fact that the BBC banned the song A Day in the Life. Why? I'd love to turn you on. I'd love to turn you on. What do you do with drugs? Turn somebody on. So it was banned because of the drug reference. In the United States, 15 weeks at the top, and then 88 weeks in the top 200 albums. It was a different type of music. Yeah, Frank Sinatra was palling around with Sammy and Dino with the Rat Pack in Las Vegas, but that was their crowd. This was the young crowd. June 16th, 17th, and 18th, the Monterey Pop Festival. The Beach Boys don't show up there. And Rolling Stone, the new magazine that came out, said the Beach Boys they're not any good anyway anymore. And also Jimi Hendrix, who performed there, said no more striped shirt beach music anymore. This was different. The Monterey Pop Festival featured nearly 36 well-known and unknown acts representing an eclectic mix of styles and sounds. That's Otis Redding, who unfortunately was killed in a plane crash shortly thereafter. And Otis Redding's biggest song was Not Sitting in the Dock of the Bay, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, Respect, which Aretha Franklin sung, was his biggest song. Otis Redding, Ravi Shankar, You Mascalela, had their first significant exposure in the United States at the Pop Festival. Also there, Eric Burdon and the Animals, the Association, the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, and the Mamas and the Papas. No Beach Boys. None of that surfing music anymore. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, there they are, the guys who are in Vietnam, and these are the early guys in Vietnam, the 1967 guys. Becoming entrenched in a war that seemingly had no end. A war that Walter Cronkite would in 1968 say the best the Americans could do was achieve a stalemate. Johnson's a war criminal. No destruction in Vietnam. The protests are becoming bigger and bigger. In the late 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, Vietnam split into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was communist. The French left Vietnam in 1954, let them fend for themselves in the Civil War. It was the Cold War at that point, and there were theories like Robert McNamara's theory of the dominoes. If South Vietnam falls to the communists, Cambodia will go, Laos will go, Thailand would go, and all of Southeast Asia would be communist. When John Kennedy became president in 1961, he vowed South Vietnam would never fall to communism. By 1965, 5,400 men were called to the draft. By December of that year, 4,500 were called up. The monthly draft call rose from 17,000 to 35,000, and young people decided they had had enough. In fact, if you were under the age of 21, you could serve in Vietnam, but you could not vote. That would be changed in 1972. And there's Joan Baez. Joan Baez, one of the folkies singing anti-war songs at that point. Joan Baez just retiring last year. And there's George Harrison, Derek Taylor, the Beatles PR guy there. They're taking a tour of Haight-Ashbury. George Harrison didn't like Haight-Ashbury. And a lot of people who in San Francisco had lived there told me George Harrison was essentially right in his characterization of Haight-Ashbury, which I'll talk about in a minute. Haight-Ashbury District was a community-based district built upon the counterculture ideals of drugs and music. That would be a social experiment. They would have access to drugs, which was perceived as a community unifier. There was a group called the Diggers that were out there from the mid to late 60s. The Diggers believed in a free society and in the good of human nature. They opened up a free store, gave out free meals daily, built a free medical clinic, which relied on volunteers and donations. And people began to flock to San Francisco. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. That was Scott McKenzie's big song written by John Phillips. San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. Anybody wear flowers in your hair in those days? You could say in chat if you did or you didn't. I certainly didn't, none of the 10 and 11 years old. So it becomes a hit. The Monterey Pop Festival cements the status of psychedelic music as part of the culture, and the hate bands such as the Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin and the Jefferson Airplane become big stars. The Summer of Love attracted a range of people into San Francisco of various ages. Oh yeah, there were the teenagers, some runaways, and there were the college students brought in by their peers, and they are going to go to a cultural utopia. And there were middle-class vacationers who just decided to go by to see what was going on. And the military personnel, hey, they had nothing left to lose. They figured they went from Oakland over to San Francisco to party with the locals in Haight-Ashbury. But it quickly devolved, and by October 6, 1967, the Diggers had a funeral for the hippies, burying the hippies once and for all. Haight-Ashbury deteriorated, overcrowding, homelessness, hunger, drug problems, crime afflicted the neighborhood. And also, a lot of people said, okay, we're through playing this. We got to go back home. We got to go to college. It's nice while we were there, but we got to get back to our normal lives. The college students went back either home or to their colleges. The mock funeral, the death of the hippie, the ceremony in the middle of Haight-Ashbury, October 6, 67. George Harrison and Patty Boyd, his wife, Patty Boyd Harrison, did visit the Haight. I went there expecting it to be a brilliant place with groovy gypsy people making works of art and paintings and carvings in little workshops. But it was filled with horrible, spotty, dropout kids on drugs. Turned me right off the scene, said Harrison. I can only describe it like a Bowery, a lot of bums and dropouts, many of them very young kids who dropped acid. He's a guy who knew how to drop acid, by the way, who dropped acid and had come from all over America to this mecca of LSD. George Harrison claimed after he went to San Francisco, he never took LSD again. I don't know if I believe him or not, but that's what he said. Meanwhile, 90 miles or so away up in northeast Sacramento, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. And Reagan characterized Haight-Ashbury this way. A hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like Cheetah. Reagan had the best comedy writers, didn't he? Hippie smell someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like Cheetah. Governor Reagan would go on the Dean Martin celebrity roast in the 1970s, but never had a line like that. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, withdraw the troops from Newark, youth against war and fascism. Seems like you're hearing the same thing in 2020. Free our black brothers. Withdraw the troops from Newark. This is 1967, and Newark would go up in flames. Now, I do this talk a lot in the Union County area, and there are a lot of people who were in Newark at the time who just moved like 8 miles and stayed in the area, who've told me that their families owned businesses there, and they knew the local people. So they would just say, please, don't burn our business. We've known you for a long time. Can you take... And they did. They listened to them. But they said it was really tense in Newark over the summer. The riots took place East Coast, in the Midwest, in Milwaukee, in Buffalo, in Tampa, in Cincinnati. There were more than 100 deaths, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage, scores of buildings burnt out, neighborhoods, some of which, both in Newark and, as Kent could tell you, in Detroit, never ever recovered from the riots of 1967. And that is Newark, New Jersey. In fact, one of the people over in New Jersey said, yeah, I knew Kraftcheck. I knew the family. And here are the troops, and they're trying to keep law and order in Newark, New Jersey back then. Now, there's a question that people have, historians have, after all these years. Was it an insurrection? Was it a race riot? What really was it? Because 53 years later, there still isn't an answer. Was it an insurrection or was it a riot? And what's the difference between the two? June 27th, a race riot erupted in Buffalo, 200 people arrested. July 12th, a race riot, Newark, New Jersey, 26 people dead, 1,500 injured, 1,000 arrested. Body counts, there are body counts around the United States. Cairo, Illinois, July 17th, race riots erupted. In Durham, North Dakota, North Carolina, July 19th, also riots there. 43 people die in a riot in Detroit, July 23rd through 27th. 1,000 people injured, 442 fires were set. Kent, who is here, we were out in Detroit in 2017 where we met Kent in the afternoon. But before we met Kent, we were on a little bus ride because we were on the tour, and we went through and saw some of those buildings that were set on fire that were still there. Race riots erupted in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The riots in Detroit forced the postponement of a Detroit Tigers, Baltimore Orioles baseball game. This guy saved my business. Don't do anything. Soul brother here, leave my business alone. And somebody's cleaning up, going through the streets in front of this guy's business. And listen, in Louisiana, hey, you want to put down some of the rioting? We'll gladly help you out. Here's a guy with his gun begging the state patrol to allow him to join them in help putting down rioting in Louisiana. What was the unrest problem? What was the unrest related to? Well, a larger problem. Deep-seated anger, hopelessness, simmering in many disenfranchised urban communities where the rates of poverty, joblessness, and crime were disproportionately high. And there is Lyndon Johnson, and I am going to pay homage as I lower my, I don't know, you probably don't have the same grid out as I do. Hail John Lindsay, hail John Lindsay. John, you did wonders for my career. Anyway, there's Lyndon Johnson, there is the New York City Mayor John Lindsay, and that is Otto Kerner. Otto Kerner is the governor of Illinois at this point, and Lyndon Johnson wants to get to the bottom of all of the problems that were taking place in 1967. So he appoints Kerner, the governor of Illinois, to head up a commission that is going to report to the president about why there were race riots or insurrection. So it's the Kerner Commission, and it's a bipartisan task force. Lindsay at that point was a Republican. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, better known as the Kerner Commission, named after the Illinois governor. And the committee is going to ask three major questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what could be done to prevent it from happening again? Those questions still have not been answered 53 years later, much like the Middle East. And there's my man, John Lindsay, in the front there. He's always with Johnson, it seems. And he's there, and there's Lyndon Johnson shaking hands after getting the Kerner Commission report. What the Kerner Commission said, you need to create 6 million new jobs. You need to create 2 million new jobs and 6 million affordable housing units. You need to revamp the welfare system. You need to eliminate de facto school segregation. You also need to eliminate abrasive police policies and establishing redress mechanisms. Now because my background's radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, improved news coverage of the problems facing Black Americans in 1967. That still remains a problem, because if you watch local news and you watch what I call murder, mayhem, entertainment, sports, and weather, look carefully at the first bunch of stories, because it's usually murder or mayhem, and it usually targets specific minority groups. That has not changed, and that's a Harvard report that came out a few years ago talking about that, so that hasn't changed. Make local government more responsive to inner city communities. And there's Lyndon Johnson, and he gets the report, and the report is published and becomes a best-selling book. But there's a problem with the report. See, Lyndon Johnson doesn't think that he gets enough credit for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and everything that took place after 1964. So he decides, I'm going to shelve the report, and that's it. That's it. I don't like the report. That's the end of it. It was a 426-page report, came out in March of 1969, sold over 2 million copies, earned a spot on the nonfiction bestseller list in the New York Times, but it all disappears because the president wasn't given enough credit for past civil rights legislation. And LBJ would refuse to support further research or even meet with the commissioners on the Kerner Commission. It is shelved, and that's it. It never sees the light of day anymore. National Organization of Women. See, you think that we only have one civil rights movement going on at this point. That's the Martin Luther King-led civil rights movement. But there were two by 1963. There would be a third, actually 4 by 1969, which would be the gays and lesbians in the United States and Northern Ireland in Europe. The National Organization of Women was founded in 1966 by Betty Friedan, which didn't make Bella Abzug too happy, because Bella Abzug thought that Betty Friedan was encroaching on her territory. Now advocated the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment. Still hasn't been passed. Enforcement of prohibitions against sexual discrimination in employment, maternity leave rights in employment, and in Social Security benefits. And they were going to do it by political means. They also wanted tax deduction for home and child care expenses for working parents, child care daycare centers, equal and non-gender segregated education. That would not happen until 1972 under Richard Nixon, Title IX. Equal job training opportunities for allowances for women in poverty, and the right of women to control their reproductive lives. That was the NOW platform back then. Also, if you take a quick look at this picture in 1967, that kind of looks like assault to me, might look like assault to you, but that's Jock Semple, and he's very upset because a woman is running in the Boston Marathon. That is Catherine Switzer, and she's a student at Syracuse University, and that big-looking guy, a big guy, all muscular guy to her left, right of the picture, is her boyfriend, who is a nationally known shot putter, 235 pounds worth of track and field guy. Catherine Switzer grew up as the daughter of a major in the United States Army. Failure? Not really an option for her. She was at Syracuse University, and some women of certain age might remember the old women are fragile, women are dainty people. They can't run a marathon. They can't even run 96 feet to play basketball. So one of her coaches said, couldn't run the Boston Marathon. So she enters the Boston Marathon as Kay Switzer, not Catherine Switzer, Kay Switzer. And she trained in secret, and she enters the race, and they don't know what to do because there's a woman. There's a woman in the race. It's all men, but she starts running. And there's her boyfriend, basically about ready to slug Jock Semple, who ran the race, because he's about ready to push her. Think of where he's about ready to push her. He is not going to give her a gentle shove to the right, which is grass. He is going to shove her face first right into the asphalt. He could probably have been arrested for assault for doing that, but her boyfriend gets, and he's running next to her the whole time because they probably figured out that stuff was going to go on, gets in the way, knocks over Semple, 235, nationally ranked hammer thrower, and he's running in the race, and he knocks over Semple, and Switzer finishes the race in 4 hours and 20 minutes, proving that a dainty, frail woman could actually run 26.2 miles, and she does it in 4 hours and 20 minutes. Over in Greece, there's a new government. They decide to knock off the old government and the old king. It was April 21st, 1967, and there's a coup. And there's 30 years of national division between the right and the left that could be traced back to World War II. During the Axis occupation of Greece, liberation 1944, and Greece would descend into a civil war fought between the communists, and now the government in exile had returned, and they're ready to take over. There was torture, and there was repression, and there were all kind of cartoons that looked like this: "Long live a democratic Greece." There was significant limitations on rights. Free elections, gone. It was illegal to strike. It was illegal to demonstrate, illegal to talk against the government, and it was illegal to congregate for any purpose except to go to church. That regime would fall in 1974. The war in Biafra started. You probably remember those old care commercials where they would ask you to send money in to feed somebody like him. The United States was not involved in this war in Biafra, but CARE was, and they begged you on commercials, send money to feed him, keep him alive, feed the starving children. The Republic of Biafra was a state in West Africa, started on May 30th, 1967, and was made up of breakaway states from the eastern region of Nigeria. And there are some of the Biafrans. The Civil War, which started on July 6, 1967, Biafra wanted their own country. They aspired to have their own country because they felt they couldn't coexist with a northern-dominated federal government, which was getting help to keep Biafra as part of Nigeria from England. Biafra was formally recognized by Gabon, Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, and Zambia. The other nations that provided support to Biafra included Israel, France, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Rhodesia, South Africa, Vatican City. Notably absent from that list is the United States. The United States was actually took a neutral position, but their neutrality and their relationship with England meant that they were thinking about Nigeria. By 1968, the Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra. They captured the coastal oil facilities, the city of Harcourt. The blockade led to mass starvation. The war would continue until 1970. There would be 100,000 military casualties, and somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million Biafrans would die of starvation. That is the short-lived flag of Biafra. The starvation caused by the naval blockade by the British and Nigerian forces surrounding the port. Eventually, the Biafran forces in 1970 would surrender to the Nigerian federal military government. That's the Loving family, the Loving family. Loving family fell in love. Well, the Lovings, actually Mr. Loving with her, Miss Jeter, fell in love, and they get married. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has to hear arguments whether or not an interracial couple that got married in Washington, D.C. could live in Virginia. The Loving against Virginia case in April of 1967. Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving got married and decided to move back to Virginia. And they were charged with breaking the state law which banned interracial marriage and were jailed. The Lovings sued Virginia, and they argued that the ban violated the 14th Amendment. It was unconstitutional. In June, it was a 6-3 ruling that state ban on interracial marriage were unconstitutional because they were based solely on racial discrimination. The decision made interracial marriage legal in the United States. At that point, there were 17 states that said no to interracial marriage. This movie would come out, about 6 months later, To Serve with Love. And Sidney Poitier shows up at Spencer Tracy's house one day in that movie. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was one of the few films of the time that depicted an interracial marriage in positive light. Interracial marriage in the United States historically was illegal in a lot of states, many states. It was down to 17 by 1967. That was 6 months in June of 67, 6 months before that movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, was released. It was still legal as of 1967, 17 states, mostly in the South. Q. You ever listen to Alice's Restaurant, you hear Arlo Guthrie, Q. Look at this guy. This guy's ready to kill. University of Wisconsin, February 1967. UW-Madison students blocked offices in Bascom Hall to protest recruitment efforts on the campus of the Dow Chemical Company. They made napalm and also Agent Orange, flammable gel that horribly burned its victims. There was another round of protests, and this one is against the Vietnam War. October 17th, 1867, University of Wisconsin, a precursor to a larger anti-war march that took place Washington, D.C. on October 18th. The protests would become violent. Chokehold there. About ready to be a chokehold. As you can see, they're about ready to become violent. The protest at UW-Madison. Well, old Cronkite, old Iron Pants put it on, and so did Huntley and Brinkley, and so did Howard K. Smith on ABC, Huntley Brinkley on NBC, and old Iron Pants on CBS. They focus on the story. People see it. It's the start of student demonstrations. And this is in front of the Pentagon. You got batons going and you got guns going against what looks like peaceful protesters sitting in front of the Pentagon. And you can see the white helmets, U.S. Marshals. U.S. troops used rifles in an encounter with anti-war demonstrators outside the Pentagon. On the Virginia side of the Potomac over in Arlington on October 21st, 1967. But you know what? It wasn't about anti-Vietnam. There were some pro-Vietnam protesters, and this one happened to be in Massachusetts. Love and support U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, and it was organized by a 19-year-old. He was a high school senior by the name of Paul Christopher, who became tired of anti-war demonstrations, and 25,000 people attend a rally in support of American troops in Wakefield, Massachusetts. So there were people who were supporting the troops in Vietnam. The Folkies weren't, and the Folkies started it with Bob Dylan, Zimmerman in 1963, Blowing in the Wind, and Phil Oakes, What Are We Fighting For? And Barry Maguire, The Eve of Destruction, and Phil Oakes, I Ain't Marching Anymore, and Tom Paxson. I left the T up there to see if people are paying attention. Tom Paxson, Lyndon Told the Nation. Lyndon Told the Nation a Lie, according to Tom Paxson, who as of a year ago was still performing in the Berkshires. But they weren't just protest songs, they were pro-war songs. Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler, U.S. Army Special Forces. He gets on the Ed Sullivan Show. and he sings the Battle of the Green Berets. He wrote the song in honor of James Gabriel, who was a Hawaiian Green Beret who was executed by the Viet Cong in 1965. And Sullivan invited him on. So it wasn't all Jim Morrison and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and eventually George Carlin. He brings on Sadler and he sings the song. And because of Sullivan, it becomes a huge hit, selling 2 million copies in 5 weeks. And of course, Arlo Guthrie, this was a couple of years ago, the Guthrie Center. Alice's Restaurant would come out in 1967. The Ballad of Arlo Guthrie and Littering. If you remember, Arlo Guthrie in 1965 is arrested and convicted of dumping trash illegally in Stockton, Massachusetts, which later leads him to be rejected by the draft board because he has a criminal record. His criminal record, he littered in Stockbridge. He littered and became a movie. And that's in the Guthrie Center. Alice's Restaurant. In the Berkshire Eagle, paper that's still up there, the Berkshire Eagle made sure that they reported the entire incident. On November 29th, 1965, described the conviction of Richard J. Robbins, age 19, and Arlo Guthrie, age 18, for illegally disposing of rubbish. They are each fined $25 plus. They have to remove trash as part of their penalty. All becomes a story. The arresting officer, Stockbridge Police Chief William J. Oberhan, who becomes Officer Obi in the song. The trial presided over Special Judge James E. Hammond. It identifies the incriminating evidence as an envelope which was thrown out to a male resident of Great Barrington. I just spoke in the Great Barrington area by Zoom, as a matter of fact. Presumably Ray Brock, not Guthrie. But they threw it out, were caught. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, they celebrated 50th anniversary of Alice's Restaurant, which is still played on Thanksgiving by some progressive rock stations, whatever is left on the FM dial. Now, Arlo Guthrie, he's there with criminals who rob plate, and they ask him, "What are you in here for?" So I littered. They all go away from him. He explained that the song, he thought there were things like just wars. And the message of this song, targeted at the Vietnam War in particular, it wasn't so much as an anti-war song, but an anti-stupidity song. He could not go into the Army because he littered and got caught. Now, I'm going to ask you a question about this, and I'll give you like 10 seconds if you want to put something in chat. I Say a Little Prayer. Is that a pro-Vietnam War song or an anti-Vietnam song? Or is it a song about Vietnam at all? If you want to put anything in chat, or if you want to unmute yourself for a second to answer it, either way, I'll give you another 5 seconds. If not,
I always thought it was a song about his experience with being young and being of draft age and all that, but it was also a story about how you can get in trouble for something totally not even really criminal.
Oh, you're talking about Arlo Guthrie. I'm talking about
Arlo Guthrie, yeah.
Okay, yeah, but I'll get back to that later because I'm talking about Say a Little Prayer. Now, was this a Vietnam song? Yes or no? I Say a Little Prayer, written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. I Say a Little Prayer. Now, the song is written in 1965. It's recorded by Dionne Warwick in 1966. But Burt Bacharach didn't like the song at all. I Say a Little Prayer. He disliked it. He thought the track was rushed. It wasn't a very good track. And it sat on the shelf until September of 1967. But let's take a look at how this song was written by Hal David. Hal David is writing a song, and he is the brains behind the song. He's trying to convey a woman's concern for her man who has gone, one of the early ones who has gone to Vietnam in 1965, one of the first people going to Vietnam. I say a little prayer. She hopes he somehow survives Vietnam. The song was not an anti-war song. It was not a pro-war song. It was written from the viewpoint of a woman who was worried about her boyfriend, her husband, going to Vietnam. Burt Bacharach to this day still does not like the song. Hey, Twiggy, remember Twiggy? She got the Beatles treatment when she came to the United States. Twiggy was Twiggy, Leslie Hornby. She wasn't very big. She was a lightweight, so to speak. She comes to Kennedy Airport, March of 1967. The New Yorker, Life magazine, long departed Newsweek, which doesn't resemble the old Newsweek, reported on the Twiggy phenomenon. New Yorker devoted nearly 100 pages to the subject. She became an international sensation. She modeled in France, Japan, and America. She, at one point, was as big as the Beatles were in 1964, in 1967. Now, this is a segue. Tom Meehan wrote for the New Yorker magazine. I knew Tom Meehan, who ended up writing the play Annie, and also became Mel Brooks' partner writing Spaceballs and The Producers on Broadway. 1967, this is my favorite movie of all time, The Producers, and Mel Brooks writes The Producers. Bialystock and Bloom, and it's about a one-time successful Broadway producer who's fallen on hard luck, can't do anything correctly, and needs to come up with a scheme to get money to put a play on. And it becomes The Producers. He bilks the little old ladies, does the worst play in the world, gets the worst play in the world about Adolf Hitler, Springtime for Hitler, all that other stuff. Somehow, he hires the worst director, hires the worst actors, and it becomes a hit. But that's the story of the movie. But inside this movie, Mel Brooks comes up with a term that is used to this day. The Producers, a satirical comedy film. Brooks would win an Academy Award, Best Original Screenplay. Decades later, the film is selected to be kept forever by the National Film Registry. It's on number 11th in the all-time laughs list as far as movie goes. But something else that endured, the term creative accounting. You have probably heard the term creative accounting. And is first used in the 1967 movie, The Producers. Bialystock, you keep saying that, but you keep saying that. But you don't tell me how. How could a producer make money with a flop? Then a hit. Bloom. It's simply a matter of creative accounting. Counting. Let's us assume, just for the moment, you're a dishonest man. Assume ahead. Well, and then he goes in, talks about how you move a decimal point here, there, or there. Yeah. You can actually make more money with a flop than a hit. Creative accounting. That term has been used many times since 1967, in the last 53 years, Mel Brooks. Hey, I got one of these. You probably have one of these as we come to the end. And he had one of these in 1967. He had a TV that he could make a telephone call and see who's on the other side of the call. The multi-channel video phone was invented and installed by Nippon Electric Company. It cost $1,300 US for a one-channel setup in 1967. So we waited a long time for this, but that guy had a video phone in 1967. Computers. Hey, it's a computer playing a guy in Boston chess. Robert Q, a computer program to play chess, was beaten in its first competition at the Boylston Chess Club tournament in Boston, Massachusetts, January 21st. The computer was at Cambridge at MIT. Carl Wagner, the opponent, was over at the NYCU several miles away. The moves were relayed to the computer the old-fashioned way by teletype. Samuel B. Morse. I was not at Expo 67 Montreal, but I was there in 1982, 1967. Come on. Expo 67 Montreal. The World's Fair officially is sanctioned, unlike the New York World's Fair in 64, 65. April 27th to October 29th, considered to be the most successful World's Fair ever held, and it celebrated Canada's 100th anniversary as a nation. And when I went up to Charlottetown a couple of years ago speaking on a cruise ship, and I wanted to celebrate the 100th anniversary in their decoration hall, couldn't. It's being rebuilt. Charles de Gaulle made some news in 1967 because he said, "Vive la Quebec." There was a separatist movement going on, and it wasn't exactly a peaceful separatist movement. There was a group there that was carrying out targeted bombing of mailboxes. But on July 24th, 67, de Gaulle stood on a balcony in Montreal and shouted, "Vive la Quebec libre." De Gaulle gave international voice to the sovereign movement that was going on, sovereignist movement going on in Quebec, caused the diplomatic incident. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, who now is at an airport in Toronto, but he was a living person back then, criticized the speech, saying de Gaulle's statements were unacceptable to the Canadian people. Eventually, Pierre Elliott Trudeau would put down the separatist movement, the violent part of the separatist movement, in 1970. The 20th century limited passenger train of the New York Central system makes its final run. Chicago to New York, December 4th, 1967, 65 years after it made its first run. If you ever listened to old Jack Benny shows, Jack Benny was on the 20th Century Limited. And there it is, before it retired in 1967. Medical news, December 3rd, 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard transplanted the heart of accident victim Denise Darville into the chest of the 54-year-old Louis Washkansky. Washkansky regained full consciousness, talked to his wife, and then died 18 days later from pneumonia. But it was a successful heart transplant, and now it's common day practice 53 years ago. And there is Dr. Barnard. And the year would end with troops in Vietnam. But there was a little hope, at least by these two guys. They're all stationed doing whatever they need to do to survive, but they plant a little Christmas tree. They're going to celebrate Christmas in Vietnam under, for them, dire conditions. The year would end in 1968. Lyndon Johnson would still be president. The war would still go on in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson would soon quit, or announced he wasn't going to run for re-election in March of 68. Walter Cronkite said Vietnam was unwinnable. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both killed in 1968. There was a Democratic convention riot in Chicago of 1968. The Smothers Brothers would get in big trouble. Censorship would go to TV, would come into TV, and the folk people would meet the rock people, and there would be music by both sides as the rock people would take over as the anti-war protesters in 1968, 1969, 70, 71, 72, 73, it would continue. Any questions or any comments? I will unmute all of you and we can have a little talk. If I unmute all of you.
Hi, Evan.
Let me unmute, ask all to unmute. Before I get to you kids, anybody want to say anything? You have the ability to unmute yourself at this point. Anybody have anything to say?
No,
Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I didn't see you say that.
Look forward to another one.
Okay, Ken, go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the thing that I remember the most about the 67 riots here in Detroit was the fact that, and you didn't mention this, but the first, and Neil Shine, the old Free Press guy, pointed this out in a documentary years ago. before he died. That in the first couple days of the riots and the looting, it was equal. It was equal opportunity looting. I mean, there were whites and blacks who went into stores, took things, stole things, whatever, and then Romney, who didn't
Romney.
want to deal with, that would be George.
George, the governor.
Yeah, George Romney, who didn't want to deal with Lyndon Johnson because he was planning on running for president, basically said, well, I gotta call Lyndon. And so he called Lyndon, and Lyndon sent in the Army. Now, the Army went to the east side of Detroit. The National Guard, which was controlled by Romney, was on the west side of Detroit. I was on the west side of Detroit. I was in Redford, Michigan, a little inner ring suburb of Detroit. And my grandparents came to live with us for a short time. And I'm using my quote thing here, short time. They ended up staying, well, my grandfather ended up staying there for 3 years. My grandmother died about a year later. She had cancer, and she died. She was very young, 58 years old. But the other thing that you failed to mention was the 1967 pennant race between 5 teams in the American League. You had Detroit, Boston, Chicago, Minnesota, and California Angels all in contention going into August. In the end, there were 4 teams in the last week of the season that could have won the American League pennant and gone on to the World Series to play the Cardinals that year. And Chicago had the easiest schedule, and they go out and lose 5 straight games. So they're out of it. Detroit comes in, and they are scheduled to play 4 games against California at the end of the season. But there's rain on Thursday and Friday in Detroit, so they play two straight doubleheaders the old-fashioned way, Saturday and Sunday. In the meantime, Minnesota is playing Boston that weekend. Boston wins, the Boston sweeps Minnesota, and the Tigers lose. They split with California. They had to win both games on Sunday. They lost the last game, and they did not win. So Boston ended up winning by a game over Detroit and Minnesota.
Wasn't that the year Willie Horton asked for peace, the Detroit Tigers?
And Willie Horton and John Conyers both went to 12th Street to try to quell the riot the day it started. Nothing worked.
Yeah, I know Willie Horton was a player with
the most
Detroit.
densely populated area of the city.
Yeah.
And it was a mixture of poor blacks, poor whites, poor Jews, poor everything, and the whole thing started because the police raided a blind pig in after hours singing party, and they found like 100 people there, and they didn't have enough personnel to get everybody out, and somebody threw a rock or a bottle, and that's how it started. The other thing, you mentioned Dionne Warwick's I Say a Little Prayer. Okay? There was also another song out there called Jimmy Mack.
Yep, but that
by
was
Martha Reeves and the
1967.
Vandellas.
Yeah, but it wasn't 67. So.
Martha Reeves is, I love her. I've met her on several occasions. She is a wonderful lady.
Ken, I'm going to cut you off because I want to see if anybody else has anything else to say. Anybody else?
Yeah.
About 1967? I can't hear you, Harriet. Hold on, Harriet. I got to ask you to unmute. Unmute yourself if you can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Harriet.
I just wanted to mention we lost 58,000 soldiers in the Vietnam War, which is a tremendous amount of people. And also when the soldiers came back from the war, people looked down on them. And they had a very high level of drug use in that war also. It was a terrible war.
Yep, it was. Anybody else before I close up here? Anybody else have anything else to say? All right, I want to thank everybody for coming. Elise and Elaine and Harriet and Peter and Deborah and Ben. I don't know who the name of the person you're with, and Drew and Eric and Carl and Ken. I want to thank Tara for inviting me, and I hope you enjoyed it. We return to this library in October when we do the 1968 talk. I have other talks coming up in the next week. Baseball next week. Let me see what else I got here while I'm not here. If you're interested, we got we're going to talk about Marty Glickman and the Olympics on Thursday and the politics of sports business on Friday. So anyway, thank you so much, and
thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll be
Very enjoyable, and it
A
brought back
lot
memories.
of research. Thank you so much.
That's what I do. Okay, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Have a
Bye-bye.
good day. Bye-bye.